Welcome to Sikorski's Think Abouts, and I'm your host, Laura Sikorski. My guests and I share our operations and technology expertise to help you provide outstanding customer service and customer experiences. Today, our guest is Scott Sachs, and he is coming from Malvern, Pennsylvania, which is just outside of Philadelphia, and he is president of SJS Solutions. And our topic today is the benefits and pitfalls of benchmarking and best practices. So often as consultants, we're asked whether or not it's a good idea to follow what somebody else does. And I think Scott has some excellent comments and perspectives for you today. And a little bit more about Scott. We actually met a couple years ago at a conference, and we kind of sought each other out because we're both management consultants to the contact center industry. But he's got an outstanding background, 25 years in the industry, and having worked for Assurant Solutions, where he had a staff of 700 in various contact centers across the country, as well as Comcast Cellular and American Express. And his business is really very similar to mine, and it's reviewing operations areas, doing audits, if you will, technology, taking a look at the technology that you have. So I really feel very comfortable that you are going to get some great ideas. So Scott, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Laura. Glad to be here.
Okay, well, let's go right off and start. Why are companies so focused on benchmarking and best practices?
Well, it's a great opportunity. So many times people in organizations see how their own operation works and doesn't really get an idea of how others are doing things. So for people to look out into the world, it's sort of like taking this journey. Think about when you're young and taking a journey into new ventures. Looking at how other organizations operate, getting some ideas of, what are other companies doing, whether it's, how they measure and how they utilize metrics, different processes, getting some competitive intelligence about how, the best in class in your industry may be doing. So there's a huge, pieces of data out there that organizations can now look at by looking at benchmarking and best practices to really improve their own operations and make sure they got the right things in place.
But do you find that people, just kind of get overwhelmed with best practices? I know myself, many of the clients, they say, well, what's the best practice for this? And what's the best practice for that? One of which is interestingly enough, is service level. They want to know, what should I have as my service level? And I said, if you make the only widget in town, you can answer, 100% of your calls in 0 seconds, or you can answer 50% of your calls in 30 seconds, because the customers want you. So what have you found as you're discussing best practices with your clients and benchmarking, what are the key benefits of using it?
I think you made a great point there. You just can't look at any specific KPI or any specific metric in isolation. So again, service level is great. And again, just because a competitor may be, answering the phone in 90% of their calls in 10 seconds doesn't mean that's the right thing for your organization. So one is, you have to look at all the different types of metrics, whether they're related to service level, quality, first contact resolution, cost, all those types of things. Again, what they are, they're data points, and that's the value of them, to get, gather all these different data points. Because the real value to me of benchmarking best practices is taking those data points and trying to understand what goes on behind them. It's not, so again, if one organization is a 90-10, service level, that's fabulous. But if they're not doing a quality program, if they're not doing, first contact resolution, it's great that you pick up the phone quickly. But if you're not, answering the customer's questions, there's definitely a major downside to that. So, the great thing is, lots of data points, not to get overwhelmed. Maybe select, 5 or 10 key metrics to look at or practices to look at, and then start looking at your own organization and start asking the questions of, is this metric or is this practice the right one for us? And if it is, how do we look at it and how do we get to that point, or how do we understand the gaps of where we are versus where that metric may be?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. What about in terms of, doing forecasting or scheduling and staffing? What have you found that people generally ask about best practices for that?
A lot of it is, simple, scheduling. A lot of organizations are, very fearful of using, part-time employees. So again, a lot of questions I get asked is, how do you bring on a part-time staff or other companies doing it? Another perfect example is work at home. There are a lot of organizations that, haven't started using work at home and are very, very fearful of it. So again, if you look at best practices, a lot of organizations are doing, work at home agents or some creative scheduling related to that. So what I'm finding is companies are asking me, we're not comfortable doing it, but we know it's out there. Is it prevalent out there? And if it is, how are other organizations doing it? So again, it's a best practice, and also trying to figure out how does that fit into an organization's solution, because a work at home solution may be very, creates a whole different set of operational questions and issues. So by understanding how other companies are doing it, but how does that impact the culture? How does that impact hiring and training? Is something that I think a lot of organizations are looking at best practices or alternative practices to see how they can bring that into their own organization. So staffing and scheduling is a very hot topic because people are struggling finding candidates who have the right skill sets and the right time zones, the right attributes, and there are lots of creative solutions, but they just don't know how to go about it.
Well, and I totally agree with that, particularly on the at-home or remote agents. I think the most difficult for anyone to cope with is how do you make those people feel part of the whole? When you're working at home and you're not, by the water cooler or in the lounge talking to your teammates. Are there any best practices that you found for those to make those at-home workers feel like they are part of the team?
Absolutely. And again, I think people underestimate how much of work is social. We may spend
Right.
8, 10 hours a day at work, but so much of it is social. So one is, how do you use the concept, let's say, of gamification or a contest to make people, feel part of an organization? How do you, the key is, supervisors speaking to their agents. So again, we've now seen, video. So supervisors are now video conferencing with their agents or doing team meetings via video conference to, again, try to mimic a face-to-face environment. So you're seeing, a lot of that stuff. It's bringing, people together, if they're remote, but maybe within a 20-mile radius, trying to bring them together for a potluck, lunch or for bowling or for some kind of, gathering. So it takes a lot of creativity, but, luckily now with video, it's making it, easier. With gamification software, it's making it easier. But it really, requires a special effort for organizations to reach out and create those channels of communication because, you just don't realize how much just walking around, tapping someone on the shoulder and saying, hey, how are you today? You're missing that in the work at home environment, how critical it is.
Yeah, and I think that, for best practices, think about that, folks out there. Scott has given you some really good ideas on best practices for remote agents. Let's talk a little bit before we break about the pitfalls and dangers of relying too much on benchmarking.
Sure. Again, benchmarking is wonderful, and best practice are wonderful, but again, just because it's the best practice for company A doesn't mean it's the best practice for company B. So one is you always have to look at something and say, again, if an organization is answering 9% of their calls in 10 seconds, it doesn't mean that's the right thing for your organization. So one is, it may not always be the best practice. It's the best practice for a certain environment. The other is you have to be careful when you start looking at numbers and metrics, and I have a bunch of examples I can go over. One, for example, is, abandon rate. A lot of companies will look for a best practice in abandon rate. And they may look at and say, hey, I'm running 5%, this other organization is running 3%. But the question is, how are organizations counting abandoned calls? There are a lot of organizations that if a customer abandons a call in the first 5 or 10 seconds, that's not considered an abandoned call in their metrics. So again, there's a perfect example where you really have to take it a step further and not just understand a number, but what goes behind the number and how do organizations, count abandoned calls. The same can go for something like a cost per call. You think about, a lot of times I know in my past, I always looked at cost per call as a key metric and we did benchmarking. But now in today's world, if someone is using a cloud environment, their cost per call could be higher than an organization in a premise environment. Because in a cloud environment, you're paying for your infrastructure on a monthly basis, which is an operating expense.
Right.
Premise, it's CapEx, and it's depreciated. So again, just because someone has a better cost per call, it doesn't mean that they're running a more efficient operation. It just may be that the expenses that are being allocated to a department are less less than how it's being allocated to your department. So there are some pitfalls of really digging deep into some of these metrics and understanding how these metrics formulate and what's behind them all.
Okay, well, believe it or not, we are ready for our break, and we are going to take a short commercial break and be right back.
Hi, I'm Tim Stead. I'm from Star Communications. We're a marketing support company. And if you need help with your next marketing project, please call 273-1900, or you can go to our website, starcommunications.us.
Welcome back to Sikorski's Think Abouts, and again, I'm your host, Laura Sikorski. Joining me today is Scott Sachs, and he's coming in to us via Skype from Malvern, PA, and he's president of SJS Solutions, which is a management consulting firm to the call center industry. And before the break, we were talking about some of the pitfalls of benchmarking and best practices. And Scott, you brought up 2 points. Do you have any others that you may want to tell our audience about?
Sure. There's another one again, an example of what goes on behind the numbers. A lot of times an organization will benchmark against another one on average handle time of a phone call, which again is an important metric for a contact center. But a lot of the average handle time may be related to how much self-service an organization provides. If you have organizations that have an IVR completion rate of say 40%, which is pretty high, their average handle time for rep calls may also be high, because the easier calls are being taken away. Where if you have an organization that has an IVR completion rate of say 10%, the average handle time for an organization may be lower because their agents again are lower, simpler calls to handle. So again, there's an idea of where you may look at a competitor or another organization and say, hey, their average handle time is 10 to 20 seconds lower than ours. But again, if you have a more robust IVR solution, higher containment rates, it's explainable. So again, you really have to look at these metrics, but also understand what goes on behind them and how they're correlated to other metrics that are out there. So those are just 3 examples, and probably go through many, many more where you just have to be understand of what goes on behind the numbers, and just don't take the number for its face value.
Exactly. I totally agree with you, because I think today we really should be more interested in the satisfaction of the customer, not necessarily how long they talk to them. It's better if they talk to them as long as we can to satisfy what their needs are.
Absolutely.
Can you give us some examples where you were able to improve operations for some of your clients using benchmarks or best practices?
Yeah, and again, it's funny because most of them have not been related to metrics. It's more towards my customer satisfaction. And again, organizations of all sizes can go out and benchmark and learn something. I have one client I've been working with recently, brand new to the contact center space, and they never even had a quality program in place. So for them, just going out and benchmarking and seeing and understand best practices, how do you do a quality program? How do you monitor agents? How do you put together a scorecard? How do you provide feedback? We're currently implementing a whole quality program for them. So there's one for, again, most big organizations have a quality program, but for this organization, they needed to establish one. So there's an example of looking at best practice, which is applicable to this organization. Also, some other simple ones we've done is, hours of operation. Again, some organizations have looked at their competition and realized that, the hours of operation they're providing service is not competitive. They may only be open 9 to 5, but they need to be open, 7 to 9, 6 days a week. So by looking at some best practices, again, we're not looking at the metrics, we're looking at, just operational type issues. Another one worked on recently is email turnaround time, where again, an organization thought that their email turnaround time was sufficient. But now, and it was sufficient maybe 5 years ago when 24-hour email turnaround was fine and expected. Nowadays, organizations are turning around emails in 1 hour.
I totally
Yeah.
agree, because I remember years ago it was faxing, and people were quite satisfied with 48-hour turnaround time. And today, because of the technology, because of the fact that we can do video, and we should be processing at a faster pace, because again, people are expecting that. If let's say a company didn't want to go through the exercise of benchmarking and best practices, but what are the best ways that if they decided, maybe I better check out something else? What are your ideas on where they can go?
Well, there's so many ways. Self-serving for both of us, hire a consultant, but we won't go down that path too much. But there are so many trade organizations out there. You can go to the trade shows. And it's not only what you learn from a speaker at a trade show, but it's who you sit next to. Everyone thinks you have to go and spend $1,000 for a major benchmarking study. But if you can go to a trade show and go to different sessions and sit next to people, it's informal benchmarking. And actually, sometimes it's more effective because, again, not only will you find out some metrics, but you'll find out how people actually do things and what they're dealing with day to day is a great way to do it. Search the webs, look for articles. Again, people are always trying to formalize, this benchmarking work, and it's not critical. There's so much, information in on the web, via websites, talking to peers, user groups. So, and again, if you want to go more formal, you can get consultants to come in and do, full-blown studies. But there's tons of stuff out there where you don't have to spend a lot of money. And, and the other thing, it's important to share because everyone's in the same situation. Everyone sits there and says, okay, I need to benchmark and go find information and find others. But when you talk to others, you find out you're all asking the same questions. How do you measure service level? How do you measure customer sat? And, sometimes just knowing others are struggling with these things is important and gives people a level of comfort that there's no silver bullet. But just talk to others. That's the best way to benchmark.
And I think that is probably a very critical point for our audience out there. I know I love to go networking and I love to go to conferences and talk to the people around. I make sure I go and not with people that I know so that I could sit at different tables and talk to different people during breaks. Well, as you know, we always end our show with think abouts. And so we want to give our audience some good ideas from your perspective on what should they do next.
Okay. One thing, benchmarking best practices is a great exercise to go through. So I encourage everybody to do, whether you are a 5-person contact center or a 5,000-person contact center. Again, the maturity level of the contact center may be different, but all of us can learn from others. We all are in our isolated worlds, and we need to reach out and see what other people are doing. Again, not that we're going to copy the idea, but just to force us to ask ourselves, what makes sense for us? What are we hearing out there, and how can we change how we're doing business is one piece of it. 2 is best practice for company A is not best practice for company B, and I mentioned this a few times before. Take the information, but you have to put it into your environment, your culture. Does it work? But again, it's important. And 3rd is don't take numbers just on face value. I'm reliving old experiences where my finance group saw a cost per call number from a benchmark study and came running to me and said, "Why can't you be at this number?" Well, maybe I can be, but let me dig deeper. Let's understand what goes behind some of these best practice numbers. What is an IVR completion rate? What goes into a numerator and denominator of a calculation? So again, I think it's a great exercise, but you really have to kind of dive in and understand it, and have it spur ideas for your organization, but also across an entire organization. You talk about customer experience. So, try to share some of these things with other organizations to see how the whole customer experience can be improved beyond the contact center.
Well, I totally agree. And Scott, this has been an absolutely excellent show, and I think our audience is going to benefit greatly from it. So if you'd like to reach Scott, He is again Scott Sachs, at president of SJS Solutions. His direct line is 610-636-1613, and his email address is Scott, SCOTT.Sachs, SACHS, at sjssolutions.net. That's a lot of S's there, Scott.
It is. Nothing easy.
Whoa! And if you want to reach me again, I'm also an independent call center, contact center consultant. My Twitter handle is at Laura Sikorski, and my cell is 631-624-6650. And of course, we want to doubly thank Samantha Matthew, our videographer. And we also want to thank Corinne Murphy-Caro, president and founder and CEO of The Daily Blue, Blue Chip Marketing, and Blueprint Magazine. Her Twitter is at The Daily Blue, at Blue Chip Marketing, which is MRKTNG, and Blueprint Media. Her phone is 631-761-9223. And with that, thank you so much for clicking in, and have a perfect rest of the day.